Gregor-Stewart. I've been working on in the role-playing game industry for about 14 years now. Over a decade was of that was spent at Fantasy Flight Games, where I was directly involved in game lines like Warhammer 40K, Star Wars role-playing, Genesys, and Legend of the Five Rings. And for about 5 years, I was also the head of the role-playing games department at FFG. And so my department produced games like End of the World, The Extraordinary Adventures of Baron Munchausen, and Star Wars Role Playing 30th Anniversary Edition. Although I wasn't necessarily directly involved in all of those, my team worked on those. And for the past 2.5 years, I've been heading development up at Edge Studio, which is another subsidiary of the Asmodee Group, just like Fantasy Flight Games is now. So there we've been continuing the development of a lot of the role-playing games that were originally created at FFG, while also designing new game lines like Midnight Legacy of Shadow and Adventures in Rokugan, which will both hopefully be out this year, pandemic supply lines and global instability willing. So, today I'm going to be talking about transforming a board game into a role-playing game. And so that's going to be discussing how to transform. Let's see if Sorry, I'm trying to share my screen really quick. There we go. So transforming these specifically um, into, there we go, these. So, excuse me. So specifically, we're going to be focusing on um, the games Descent, Android Netrunner, and Keyforge. Although I realize Descent also has a lot of other games that were made in that universe. Rune Wars, Rune Bound. I believe there was another Rune Wars that was a custom, which was a deck building game. Um, it's a big tabletop game for it. There's a lot of games, especially in Descent. But in any case, so we'll be focusing on those settings and the games that came with them, and how they were converted into campaign settings for specifically for the Genesys role-playing game line. And first, just to make sure, I assume a lot of people are familiar with Genesis, but the for those of you who aren't, the only important thing really to know for this conversation is that Genesis is the universal role-playing system that we developed at Fantasy Flight, and now we are producing at Edge. So it is a game system that we designed specifically that could work in multiple settings. And so every one of the source books we have created for it allows you to use that rule set for science fiction, traditional fantasy, space fantasy, which is sort of what we called Keyforge, um, eventually space opera when Twilight Imperium is released, but we'll talk about that later today. Um, so, we'll focus on those for the purposes of this conversation, but I think the principles that will come up can be applied in pretty much any time you want to adapt a setting from another medium, but especially a board game and or a card game, and turn it into a role playing game. So, Fantasy Flight Games has a lot of very interesting settings. I mean, some of these have been developed over the course of decades, especially Terrinoth and Twilight Imperium. Those settings have been around forever. Other settings, like their Arkham Horror setting, have evolved out of other IPs, the Lovecraft mythos that were created back in the 1920s. So there's been a lot of development into these settings, but because Fantasy Flight Games has always been primarily a board game company, albeit with a lot of role playing games developed alongside of it, that development has almost always happened through board games and card games. We'll ignore some of the very early role playing games that Fantasy Flight worked on. That, but especially because they don't really come in, they don't really apply here. And in some cases, like the nine mythical original Twilight Imperium role playing game for D20, you basically can't find them anymore anyway. So, some of the advantages and limitations of board and card games when you're talking about developing a setting. Um, the first and foremost one that comes to mind is that the fluff, the setting and story information, can only be conveyed through very limited means in a board and a card game. You can depict it through art, through card titles, um, thr through a few descriptive sentences, and sometimes through how some mechanics interact. Excuse me. Now, I say this is a limitation, but I actually do also see it as an advantage because, especially when players are playing those games, it en- um, it encourages players to fill the blank spaces with their own imaginations. Because honestly, I firmly believe that settings are much more powerful when they leave room for the people who engage with them to expand them in their own minds and with their own imaginations. Um, but that's a problem for us because us as in role playing developers, because when we set out to make a role playing game, players have a lot of expectations for that. Role playing game based on that stuff they've come up with in their own imaginations. So that's one consideration and limitation we have to take into account. Um, Another limitation, and a big one, is the difference in mechanics. So board games obviously work in their own mechanical system, which is primarily intended to be a fun game in and of itself. Like, that is the goal of creating a game, is to create a fun play experience. Keyforge, for example, you have cards with health and attack value, attacking opponents. You're trying to collect a resource called amber. You're trying to keep your opponent from collecting that resource. Um, you are trying to play your cards to create combinations, etc., etc. Um, Netrunner is Netrunner is a all about attacking a series of unknown cards that your opponent has laid out in a specific order, and each of these cards will have some sort of obstacle in them, and you're hoping that you can overcome that obstacle with your own known and unknown cards, or obviously in reverse, you might be the one creating those obstacles and you're hoping to trick uh, your opponent into making a mistake. Descent is probably the closest to a regular role playing game because Kevin Wilson originally designed it to emulate the dungeon crawl style role playing game. Um, Even in this case, however, there are a lot of mechanical limitations as to what you can and can't do and how your characters can and can't act. And that really gets to what I see as the heart of it, which is that fundamentally, board and card game mechanics are what I would call a closed system. You can only do things in the game that the rules allow you to do. Uh, as a example, in Netrunner, the player who controls the corporation can't turn to the player who controls the runner and say, "How about I just give you 200,000 credits to stop running on our servers and just go retire to Bora Bora?" I mean, there's no rules for it. You can't do it in that game. Um, But in role-playing games, I see them as an open system. Basically, you can just do, or at least attempt to do, anything you want because there's an intelligent arbitrator for anything your character attempts. In board and card games, the rules have to be both the rules and the game master. But in role playing games, we have a real person who's the game master. So they get to decide if something is possible or not, and how, and what the results of that decision, what your attempts are, in real time. So, however, with that openness comes something that people don't expect of board and card games, but they do expect of role playing games, and that is realism. Players tend to expect that role playing games feel like a world that, even if it is not truly realistic, needs to follow rules and function similarly to how they expect the real world to function. Characters need to eat and sleep. They need resources to get things they want. There are consequences to them doing stuff. NPCs react to their actions, and they can get hurt and even die. In Descent, they can put a respawn mechanic into the game and nobody questions it. In a role playing game, if somebody keeps coming back to life in the middle of a town every 15 minutes and then charging off into a dungeon, your players may start asking things like, "Wait, so does everybody just come back to life in the middle of town? Is death even like a thing in this world? Does this work for animals as well as people? Does it work for the bad guys? Every time do we kill an enemy, are they just respawning somewhere else? And like, how do you feed everyone then? How is overpopulation not a problem? I mean, I'm sure that for those of you who have game mastered, you've gotten those types of questions from your players a lot. So, given all that, let's talk about the conversion process a little bit. Um, when you convert a board game or card game into a role playing game, um, I feel there are two things you should think about. Um, the setting that you're creating and expanding on, and the experience that you're evoking. And expanding on the setting is fairly straightforward in the end, because there are some pitfalls you have to consider, but overall what you're doing is you're just trying to create a world that has the same fluff, shall we say, story touchstones as the game you're taking it from. So let's take Android for an example again. In Android Netrunner and the other Android games that have come out, um, some of the big touchstones would be uh, clones and biroids, the titular androids. Um, there are runners and corporations, and there is a network, a future internet that the runners need to be able to hack. So an Android setting needs all those. An Android setting needs a huge city named New Angeles. It needs a massive space elevator called the Beanstalk. Um, all of those are big thematic parts that show up all the time in the game, so you need to make sure they're a part of your setting. It needs to happen in the future. Um, Keyforge, on the other hand, it needs this crucible, this place in the center of the universe where chunks of different worlds get melded together and weird hijinks ensue. It needs the different species that show up in the crucible and the factions. So the Brobnar, the big troll giant titan guys who mechanize their bodies, or the Lojos, who are all about rebuilding their bodies with cybernetics, and they're searching for knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. Terrinoth, if you don't have the like iconic trolls and dragons you see on the cover of the board games, if you don't have runes, like magical runes that are physical objects that you can use to channel magic through, um, if you don't have orcs and dwarves and elves, because Terrinoth is in very many ways a generic fantasy, it's not going to feel like fantasy, or it's not going to feel like Terrinoth. So once you get those big touchstones in, then the work starts. You have to start filling in the details. So how big is New Angeles? I mean, it's 500 million to 1 billion people in Android. Where is it? It's in modern day Ecuador. Why is it in modern day Ecuador? Well, you want to put a space elevator on the equator if possible. Are there other countries on Earth? Sure. Let's talk about what the U.S. is doing, what the Europe and the European Union are doing. Let's talk about what Africa is doing. um, and then let's see what happened the last few centuries to cause things to change the way they did. You talk about the technologies that developed, climate change, the politics. Um, the questions will just go on, and really, you can basically write forever because you're creating an artificial world that can be just as detailed as the real one. So I would say the bigger thing is to know when to stop and know when you're getting too into the weeds. It was that reason that when we did Shadow the Beanstalk, we focused specifically on New Angeles and the moon. Because, or Heinlein on the moon, I should say, because that was we felt was most core to the experience and was also the newest and most interesting thing about the setting. Like, honestly, how many people want to see the new United States that's kind of similar to the current United States, speaking as an American there, or the European Union as, sort of just an evolution of the existing European Union. Um, so once you have your setting developed, you have to think about the experience. And that is what I would say is the more difficult part and the more important part. So if you just fill out the setting, you're creating a world atlas, but people don't just want to read an atlas of a fictional world. They also want to play in it, experience it, and alter it through their own actions. So you need to figure out a core experience for your games, this core conceit that what your players are going to be doing. Um, and it shouldn't be the same as the board game or the card game. For one thing, if people want that core experience, they'll just play the board or card game. Two, they're like the board or card game is likely to do it better because it is designed to emulate that. Shadow of the Beanstalk can't do running on servers as well as the card game Netrunner could because like every mechanic was based around that. And finally, three, you're really missing out. Um, if you try and focus on what the board game focused on, then you're missing on all the things the board game can't do, going back to that open versus closed system. So, what you should need to do is figure out the core themes of your game. You look at the original games, then look at the setting and what themes do you see prevalent throughout. For example, in Android, you see the themes of inequality, the promise and folly of unrestrained capitalism, slavery, and the question of like, what does it mean to be human? In Descent, there are themes of exploration, adventure, ancient danger, and forgotten secrets that if you uncover might be bad for you. And finally, in Keyforge, there's that same exploration, but there's this weirdness and bizarre experiences, but also this focus on adaptability, the acceptance of differences, and the strengths that come from a truly cosmopolitan world. And so once you have those themes figured out, you can then decide how to present them through the lens of a core experience. Um, so in Android, we presented the theme of you and your friends are just regular people who get swept up in big events, and you have to survive, get a paycheck, and through doing that, you learn to interact with um, the androids because your fellow players may be androids. In Descent, it's all about adventuring, experiencing this ancient world, and uncovering secrets that may be really terrible for you. And for Keyforge, also exploration, but you're a bunch of misfits and outcasts. But here in the Crucible, you're just regular people, so you're learning to fit in and rely on your difference to do ridiculous and fun things. So that is a brief talk about adapting these settings, and we have a couple of minutes before I have to get to the next seminar. So if anyone has any questions they want to ask, now is the time. All right. Well, if nobody has any questions, then let's call it here, and I will see you all in a couple minutes, hopefully, for my talk on Twilight Imperium. All right.
Thank
Have
you
a good
very
day.
much. Goodbye.
Yep. See ya.